Well, we have Professor Michael Holt, who is Professor Emeritus at the University of Virginia and the celebrated author of the book By One Vote, which is quite the compelling read, especially now. This is a book that retraces the election of 1876, a nail-biting election. So welcome, Professor Holt.
I'm glad to be here.
So before we retrace the 1876 election, the first question is there any chance that the 2020 election could be a replay of 1876?
Well, yes and no. If it's a Biden blowout, so that there's no chance that any disputed electoral votes will change the outcome, no. But if it's close enough, I expect there'll be disputes by the time the Electoral College meets in some states, and courts will get involved. I do not think that the solution that was reached in 1876 of a federal electoral commission will be repeated, but certainly we could have some fireworks.
Well, you know, when we go back and look at 1876, because I don't think it was resolved until about 3 days out from the inauguration.
That is correct.
That's pretty tight. And what was the environment like? I know there had been a financial crisis. Of course, we were still, I guess, the vestiges.
The environment. The environment during the election itself, before we got to the dispute over the results of the election, I would point to three things. The country was in the midst of the most serious depression, with considerable unemployment in the 19th century. There was an aura of corruption hanging over the incumbent Republican administration of Ulysses Grant. Grant did not try to run again. And since the end of 1872, when the Ku Klux Klan Act expired in terms of the authority of the president to declare martial law in the South, there had been rampant physical, often lethal intimidation of Black voters in the South. So that
was the environment.
That was the environment of the election itself. The environment after the election, when the votes were in dispute, was that Democrats thought they'd won the election. They thought that the Republicans were going to steal it from them, and many of them were ready to go to war. They talked about raising armed posses or armies and marching on Washington. They talked about getting some Union generals from the Civil War who were Democrats to lead this army. And in response to this threat, Ulysses Grant ordered more troops to come to Washington to fend off any armed attempt to march on the Capitol.
Well, now, Samuel Tilden was the Democratic nominee. Rutherby Hayes was the Republican. Now, from what I've read, and you're the one who's the author, Tilden was not exactly what you'd call a warm and fuzzy sort of candidate, was he? I mean, did he aggressively campaign, or did he just assume there was so much disaffection with the Republicans he'd win anyway?
First of all, nobody campaigned personally in the 19th century. This was not done. But Tilden worked very hard pulling strings. He was the sitting governor of New York in 1876. He didn't go out. There weren't primaries, but he was a very wealthy man, and he used his money to send out people to line up delegates at the Democratic Convention to get the nomination. I might add about Tilden. As I said, he was an extraordinarily wealthy man. He lived in a big house on Gramercy Park in New York City, but it's his money that built that gigantic New York Public Library on Fifth Avenue and 42nd Street. He paid for that construction.
It's pretty nice. That's a wonderful library. Rutherby Hayes, he was a newcomer, was he not?
Well, yes and no. He was outside of Washington, and he thought that was to his benefit. Because there there was an odor about people from both parties in Washington. But he was in his third term as governor of Ohio, which was the most important swing state in the 19th century.
So we have this election. Tilden wins the popular vote, 4,300,590, and Rutherby Hayes has 4,036,298. So Tilden has 184 electoral votes, arguably at that point. You only need 185, and Rutherby Hayes has 165, but we have 20 electoral votes in dispute: Louisiana, South Carolina, and Florida. How did what was the immediate thought about how to resolve this?
Let me correct one thing.
Okay, sure.
The three southern states had 19 electoral votes between them or among them, and they were in dispute. Both parties claimed that they had won those states. But there were 20 electoral votes in dispute because Tilden himself intervened to try to get one of Oregon's 3 electoral votes on the grounds that the presidential elector had held a federal job at the time of the election, and therefore he was disqualified.
Right.
And would give that one of those Oregon votes, so that there were 4 states that had disputed electoral results for Congress to deal with eventually. But what happened with the 3 southern states is that all of them, they were the last states that the Republicans controlled in Reconstruction. All of them had returning boards that were controlled by Republicans, and they would count the votes from all the counties in the states, and they all had explicit legal authority in the acts creating them to disallow votes, entire votes, from any polling place or entire county where there was evidence of fraud or voter intimidation. And in those 3 southern states, there was plenty of evidence of fraud or voter intimidation, and fraud by both parties, by the way. But they counted out enough of the votes purportedly given to the Democrats that they ruled that the Republicans were going to get all 19 of those votes. The Democrats contested that, and they sent their own electors claiming that they'd gotten the electoral votes from those 3 states.
So not unlike today, of course, it was a different type of Democrats and Republicans of what we have today, but the House, as I thought I read, was in the hands of Democrats. The Senate was in the hands of Republicans, and many perceived the Supreme Court to be more Republican than Democrat.
Yeah, because virtually everybody on the Supreme Court, except 2 people, had been appointed by Republican presidents. And Lincoln had actually gone out of his way to appoint a Democrat from what was then the 10th Circuit from California, a guy named Stephen Field. But on a 9-member court, it may have been a 6-3 Republican over Democrat majority, maybe even 7-2. But the one thing I want to point out that is different from today, where it seems on the face of it, with the Democrats control the House and Republicans the Senate, is that the Congress that would decide on this, that would have to count the electoral votes, was the second session of the 44th Congress. That is, these were House members that had been elected in 1874. It wasn't the people elected in 1876 in the House that would hear these things. And of course, Republicans and the senators weren't elected by popular vote then, and it would depend on when legislatures met to see if any the complexion of the Republican majority in the Senate changed. So essentially, it was the same Congress that was sitting during the election itself that would have to decide the results of the election.
So, but before we get to this electoral commission that was, I think, only a creature of 1876 and the 1870. Is that right? I mean, did we ever have any other?
There was no precedent, and
Yeah.
I suggested I don't think there'll be a successor, but to it, because it's my understanding that Congress subsequently passed a law, I think in 1882 or 1887, allowing Congress finally to resolve disputes about how the two houses are going to do that.
Same problem. Yeah, I mean, unless the Democrats win or both, or Republicans win both chambers. But even now, it isn't the Democratic voting members that get to choose. It's each state one vote, and that's controlled by who controls the legislative branch within that state. So,
certainly who controls the House delegation from that particular state. And it's my understanding now that Nancy Pelosi is very worried because Republicans control more states. They have all those plain states and western states, that they control the House delegations. So some of which, of course, are only one person.
Yeah. So it's interesting that both parties bought into this electoral commission. Actually, even though there was no precedence to it, there is seemingly some level of collegiality reflected in having a commission that reflected the House, the Senate, and some members of the court. Do you think, I mean, that's the impression I get looking at it. Is that a fair characterization?
Yes and no. I mean, the problem was that the 12th Amendment is no help at all and describing how disputes, disputed multiple electoral votes from states should be decided by Congress. It simply says that they should be sent under seal to the President of the Senate, who's normally the Vice President, and wasn't in this case, but and before a joint session of Congress. The President of the Senate should open the envelopes and the votes shall then be counted. But that passive voice, hid who was actually going to do the counting. All the people in the room, or just the President of the Senate, or what? And the Republicans claim that the President of the Senate, he has the authority to decide these disputed votes. And the Democrats said, well, if you're going to say that, because all joint sessions have to be held in the House and we control the House, we won't invite the Senate into the House. We won't have any joint sessions. So we'll be at a standoff. And then people decided by really late December, the Electoral College had met on December 6th, that we've got to do something about this. And each House appointed a bipartisan committee to figure out how to resolve this. The Democrats controlled the House committee. The Republicans controlled the Senate committee. They didn't meet together. They met separately. At one point, the Democrats came up with this solution. It should only be 5 associate justices of the Supreme Court who should decide this. But then they mutually kind of stumbled together by late December and to form this federal electoral commission that would have 5 from the Senate and 5 from the House, 3 Democrats and 2 Republicans from the House, 3 Republicans and 2 Democrats from the Senate, and 5 Supreme Court justices. But the way they chose this, they named 4 associate justices. They didn't want the Chief Justice because he was from Ohio and therefore a friend of Hayes. He knew Hayes. and they picked them by the circuits they rode in, but it was really to pick 2 Democratic justices and 2 Republicans, and they were then supposed to pick the 5th justice. And everybody at the time thought that they would pick a guy named David Davis. And Davis is a very interesting guy. He was a very large man, by the way, but he'd been a Whig and then a Republican judge in Illinois. He had been Lincoln's campaign manager in 1860, and it was Lincoln who appointed him to the court. But then he broke with Republicans during Reconstruction. Indeed, he'd been a third-party presidential candidate in 1872, but he was considered to be the closest thing the court had to a neutral person, somebody who wasn't Democratic and wasn't Republican. And everybody figured that supported this bill. And in the votes establishing this committee, Democrats were much more enthusiastic about creating this commission than were Republicans. But the day before the vote in the 2 chambers to establish this commission, members of the Illinois state legislature elected David Davis to the Senate as a Democrat. The Democratic majority elected Davis, attempting to sway how he would vote on the commission. And Davis was telegraphed this information, and he announced that he could no longer be independent because the Democrats had picked him, and he refused to serve. This information didn't get to all the members of the House and Senate when they voted to establish the commission, but it was then left to these 4 justices who'd been named in the bill to pick a 5th justice, and they picked a fellow named Joseph Bradley from New Jersey, who happened to be the guy who rode the circuit in the Deep South. The atmosphere in Washington was hardly collegial that winter.
But they ended up with a compromise.
And it was even more explosive in the
than it is today.
Well, when people are telegraphing to Tilden and said, we can raise 100,000 men and let's get a Democratic Union general to lead this army like George McClellan or Winfield Scott Hancock, and we will march on Washington and we will force the seating of Tilden as president. It was pretty explosive. And Tilden, to his credit, said, for Pete's sake, don't do that. Let us work this out. We're going to win anyway. We don't need to try to decide the election by armed force.
So,
quite unlike the incumbent today, who seems to be encouraging.
Yeah, unfortunately.
As a response to
So ultimately, the agreement, there was a 1877 compromise that allowed Rutherford B. Hayes to become president, he who needed all 20 electoral votes, right?
That's right. And the commission ended up with 15 people and eight Republicans and 7 Democrats. And they decided in every case by an 8-7 vote that all 20 disputed electoral votes should go to Hayes, giving him 185 to 184 edge in the electoral college vote.
Well, it signaled the end of Reconstruction in the sense that...
Well, okay, yeah, that's right. Yeah.
That they withdrew federal troops. Your
question was about the so-called Compromise of 1877, and I think I spent some time. I'm hardly the first one to do this, to dispel the notion that there ever was a compromise of 1877. Grant, in fact, had ordered the troops removed as soon as the election was over. Well, as soon as the electoral colleges had met, but his orders went astray. And so the troops would have been removed anyway. And it was certainly true that had Tilden come in, it would have been the end of Reconstruction anyway. And there were supposedly economic parts of this compromise that were never carried out. So it's not clear that was done. But the troops were removed in Florida by the end of the calendar year of 1876. And it is true that Rutherford Hayes would order the troops in South Carolina, in Louisiana, back to their barracks. The federal troops were, in fact, never removed from the states. They were just sent back to their barracks within those states and stopped interfering with state politics.
Well, as a sort of a closeout, there are a great many people who are very anxious about this November election because we are a reasonably polarized country now. And maybe we just perceive it that way because we're flooded with information and, so forth. But it would seem, looking back over the arc of American history, and you're the historian, I am not, that America has always struggled with the notion of sort of this one nation, sea to shining sea. Is that too much of a stretch to say that, or
I have to say I smiled when when I saw that question that you kindly sent me in advance. Of course, there have always been internal disputes and conflict. In the 19th century, it was largely along sectional lines, first North versus South, and then once money, the form of money became a serious question after the Civil War. The funding of the Civil War created this huge headache about what to do with bonds and greenbacks and national banknotes. There was a significant split along east-west lines in the United States, and there have been contentious political splits in the 20th century and certainly in the 21st. But at only one time, it seems to me, were we seriously involved in not being one nation, and that's when Southerners seceded in response to Abraham Lincoln's election.
Well, let's hope that all the angst around this election is unwarranted. Your insights have been enormously helpful, Professor Holt, and let us hope some of the angst that we're experiencing regarding this November election are overplayed, overblown, not warranted. But we now understand that there's a path by which we can resolve these issues. And let us hope we have no issues in November of this year.
It's true. I let me finish on this note. My wife and I voted 10 days ago, early. We had to stand in line for an hour and a half. There were so many people trying to vote early. I'm 80 years old. I probably shouldn't have been standing in that line. But I think this is going to be a really high turnout election, if counting the mail-in ballots, that we might actually get a decent percentage of people participating. I mean, that's one of the things about 1876.
Yeah, there was 81%.
The highest turnout of any presidential election in American history.
When I saw that, I couldn't believe it. 81+% voter turnout in 1876. I think we're going to have from what you're telling me, we're going to have pretty significant turnout this November.
Yeah,
well,
I don't think we're going to reach that level, but we barely get above 55% in presidential elections. So maybe it'll be better than that.
Yeah. Well, Professor Holt, we can't thank you enough. You're the ultimate authority on this 1876 election, and I understand lawyers on both sides of this campaign are seeking your counsel. So it's going to be a rocky ride, that's for sure. Well, thank you very much, Professor Holt.
My pleasure.
Thank you.